I always thought highways at night were lonely places, vast stretches of asphalt surrounded by silence and a darkness so thick it feels like the road itself could swallow you whole. It was on one such highway that I found myself on a chilly October night, driving home from a late shift. The route was familiar, miles of straight road cutting through the countryside, but something felt off. At first, it was small things. The way the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long in my rearview mirror, the occasional flicker of headlights in the distance that would disappear when I glanced back. I brushed it off, blaming my tired mind and the rhythmic drone of the car engine for playing tricks on me. But then, the taillights of a car ahead appeared, glowing red like twin embers in the void. I hadn't seen a car in miles, and I didn't remember passing anyone. As I drew closer, the vehicle became clearer. An old, battered sedan, its paint peeling and rust eating away at its edges. The car crawled forward, its driver keeping a maddeningly slow pace, forcing me to either tail them or pass. I decided to overtake. As I sped up to move alongside the sedan, I instinctively glanced at the driver. My breath caught in my throat. The figure behind the wheel was shadowed, their features obscured by the dim light of the dashboard, but I could feel their eyes on me. An unblinking, cold gaze that seemed to pierce through the glass and settle deep in my chest. I quickly looked away, accelerated, and left the car behind. Relief washed over me as the sedan disappeared in my rearview mirror, its eerie presence fading into the darkness. But the relief was short-lived. Minutes later, headlights appeared again behind me, growing closer with alarming speed. It was the same sedan. My pulse quickened as it closed the distance, its front bumper practically kissing my rear. I tapped the brakes lightly, a warning, but the car didn't back off. Instead, its headlights began to flash, erratically pulsing like some deranged heartbeat. Panic bubbled in my chest. I pressed harder on the gas, pushing my car to its limits as the sedan continued its relentless pursuit. I don't know how long I drove like that, the road stretching endlessly before me. My only company the roar of the engine and the ever-present glow of those headlights in my mirror. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the wheel, and my mind raced with questions. Why me? What did they want? Every horror story I'd ever heard about stalkers and highway killers flooded my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. My car's fuel gauge edged closer to empty, and I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. I needed to lose them. Spotting an exit sign, I veered off the highway without signaling, my tires screeching as I took the turn at a dangerous speed. For a moment, I thought I'd lost them. The road behind me was empty, the oppressive weight of their presence lifting slightly. But then, like a predator emerging from the shadows, the sedan reappeared, its engine growling as it tore onto the exit behind me. Desperation clawed at my throat. I turned onto a narrow, winding road, its edges flanked by towering trees that loomed like silent sentinels. My headlights carved a feeble path through the darkness, and I prayed for a house, a gas station, anything, a sign of life where I could find safety. The road seemed to twist endlessly, and my pursuer stayed with me at every turn. Then, out of nowhere, my headlights illuminated something ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a halt mere feet from them. The figure didn't move, their silhouette eerily still as the sedan's headlights illuminated them from behind. My heart pounded as I locked the doors, my mind screaming at me to drive around them, to escape. But before I could react, the figure turned toward the sedan and pointed. The car stopped abruptly, its engine dying with a guttural shudder. The silence that followed was deafening. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. They wore a tattered coat, their face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. Slowly, they began to approach my car. My hand fumbled for my phone, but the screen remained dark. No signal, no escape. The figure reached my window and tapped on the glass with a single, pale finger. Against every instinct screaming at me to ignore them, I turned my head. Their face was wrong. The features were distorted, as though someone had taken a human visage and stretched it like melted wax. Their lips moved, but no sound came out. their hollow eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I don't remember putting the car in reverse, but suddenly I was speeding backward, the figure and the sedan growing smaller in the distance. The road was a blur as I found my way back to the highway, my only thought being to put as much distance as possible between myself and that place. Hours later, I stumbled into the safety of my home, locking every door and window before collapsing onto the floor. Sleep didn't come easily that night, and when it did, it was haunted by visions of headlights and hollow eyes. Days passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I got into my car, I half expected to see that sedan in my rearview mirror. Weeks later, I found a note taped to my windshield. It was a single piece of paper, yellowed and crumpled, with 3 words scrawled in jagged handwriting: "See you soon." I had driven that highway 100 times, maybe more, and it was always the same, quiet, empty, and oddly comforting. The kind of road that stretches endlessly through the dark, broken only by the occasional flicker of a streetlight or the soft hum of the tires beneath me. But on that night, something changed. I first noticed it when the air in my car grew thick, almost suffocating. The windows were rolled up, the air conditioning humming softly, but it felt as though something was pressing down on me, a weight that didn't belong. The highway was as desolate as ever, not a single car in sight, not even the usual stretch of fields beside me. It was just blackness on both sides, as if the world had narrowed down to this single, solitary strip of road. I had no reason to feel uneasy, but the tightness in my chest, the sudden thumping of my heart, told me otherwise. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing. The wind picked up slightly, but it wasn't enough to open the windows. I was just tired, I reasoned, and the stillness was making me paranoid. Then it started. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. A slight sound, almost like a whisper, faint but persistent. I turned the radio down, convinced that it was just static, but it didn't stop. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, like voices, low and murmuring, just on the edge of comprehension. I strained my ears, my palms growing clammy on the steering wheel. I looked around, but the road was still empty, the trees just dark shapes looming on either side. There was no one else around. I couldn't tell where the sound was coming from, but it was everywhere, surrounding me, pressing in from all sides, getting closer. My hands tightened around the wheel, my breathing shallow as I tried to convince myself it was just the wind. But then I saw it. At first, it was just a flash, something darting in the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, but nothing was there. My heart pounded in my chest, my body rigid with fear. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, my mind racing, trying to find a rational explanation for the creeping dread that filled me. And then it happened again. A shadow, flickering in the distance, too quick to fully comprehend but too real to ignore. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, pushing the car faster down the road, trying to outrun whatever was following me. But no matter how fast I went, the shadow kept pace. It wasn't just one either. There were more, shifting in and out of the darkness, always at the edges of my vision. They were there, but not fully, like half-formed figures that disappeared whenever I tried to look directly at them. I tried to focus on the road, but the whispers were growing louder, more urgent, and I felt something intangible, closing in on me. It wasn't until I glanced in my rearview mirror that I realized just how bad it was. The road behind me was still empty, but the reflection in the mirror showed something else entirely. A figure stood at the edge of the highway, barely visible in the dim light, but I could see it clearly enough to know it wasn't human. It had no shape, no features, just a swirling darkness, a void that seemed to pulse with a sickening energy. My heart skipped a beat, and I snapped my gaze back to the road, pushing the pedal to the floor. I glanced again in the mirror, nothing, but the whispers didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to be growing louder, almost as if they were inside my head, calling my name, urging me to pull over. I shook my head, desperate to drown it all out, but it was no use. The whispers turned to growls, low and guttural, like something trying to claw its way through the very fabric of reality. My hands were shaking now, sweat running down my back as I gripped the wheel with white knuckles. I didn't dare look back again, afraid of what I might see. My car's headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the farther I drove, the darker it seemed to get. The trees, once just shadows in the distance, were now pressing in, their branches reaching out like fingers, clawing at the air, trying to drag me off the road. I could see shapes now, figures shifting in the trees, moving just out of reach, their forms blending with the darkness, impossible to distinguish. I couldn't tell if they were real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, my mind unraveling as the road stretched on, endless and unchanging. I wanted to stop, wanted to pull over and just escape, but I knew that whatever was following me, whatever was out there in the darkness, it would catch me. I could feel its presence growing closer, could sense its hunger, its need to claim me. The whispers were deafening now, all around me, pressing into my skull, demanding that I stop. The road ahead blurred as tears filled my eyes, but I couldn't stop, couldn't. The car's engine began to sputter, the sound of it grinding against the metal filling the silence. My fingers were slick with sweat, and I wiped them on my pants, trying to steady myself. Then, in the distance, I saw it, just for a moment, a flash of light like the headlights of another car, but it wasn't. It was too bright, too blinding, and it wasn't moving, just hanging there in the distance like a star. I slowed down, my heart thudding in my chest, but as I got closer, the light didn't move. It was just there in the center of the road, and I knew in the pit of my stomach that I couldn't reach it. I couldn't get to the end of this road. It would never end. The whispers had stopped. The growling had stopped. But the presence was still there, just behind me, just out of reach. I knew, without a doubt, that I was never going to make it home. The road was mine forever now. It was well past midnight when I found myself alone on that stretch of highway, a long, empty road that cut through the dense woods like a scar in the landscape. The sky above was an impenetrable black, not a single star in sight, and the only sound was the hum of my tires against the pavement, a constant, monotonous rhythm that seemed to match my growing unease. My headlights sliced through the darkness, illuminating only a few feet in front of me, but that was all I needed, nothing more. My car was the only vehicle on the road, or so I thought. I had just finished a late shift at work, my mind foggy from exhaustion and the heavy weight of a long, tiring day. The cold night air and the isolation of the highway seemed to make everything feel sharper, more vivid, like I was hyper-aware of every little thing around me. The road was endless, stretching out into the unknown, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I had driven this route countless times before, but tonight felt different. The deeper I went, the more unsettling the silence seemed, the more intense the darkness pressed in on me. As I drove, my eyes flicked to the rearview mirror every few seconds, as they always did, a habit born out of pure instinct. But tonight, there was something strange about the mirror. It wasn't just the emptiness of the highway that bothered me. It was the reflection. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something was wrong. It wasn't as though the road behind me was empty. It was as if the reflection in the mirror showed something just beyond my reach, something that was never there when I glanced back. But every time I looked, my mind would convince me there was nothing but the black road, the distant trees, the occasional flicker of a shadow. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck prickle, an uneasy feeling clawing at my senses. Still, I pressed on, determined to get home. My eyes remained fixed on the road, but each time I stole another glance into the mirror, I saw it, the faintest shadow moving just behind me. Not a person, not a figure. No, it was something far more disturbing. A subtle presence that seemed to be following me, lingering at the edges of the reflection. But when I would turn my head back toward the windshield, I saw nothing. My heart began to pound in my chest, the rhythmic thumping of my pulse drowning out the steady hum of the tires. I wiped my hands on my jeans, feeling a cold sweat break out on my brow. I couldn't take my eyes off the rearview mirror now. Every few seconds, that dark, fleeting shape appeared again, as if someone was trailing me just out of sight, always in my peripheral vision. The shadow seemed to grow stronger, darker with each passing moment, and my breath came in shallow gasps as I forced myself to look ahead, hoping that whatever was following me, wouldn't catch up. I glanced once more into the mirror, and this time, the shadow wasn't just lingering. It was there, right behind my car, moving in sync with me. It wasn't a human figure, nor did it have any defined shape. It was more like a presence, an overwhelming, oppressive force that pressed against the very air around me. I nearly lost control of the car as my hand shot to the wheel, my grip tightening as I tried to steady my racing heart. My foot pushed harder on the gas, but no matter how fast I went, it was always there, right behind me, closing the distance. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, and the silence grew heavier, as though the world around me had grown still, suspended in a moment of unexplainable tension. I fought the urge to stop, to pull over, but every fiber of my being screamed at me to keep driving. I dared not look back again, but the mirror caught my attention in a brief, fleeting moment, and there it was right behind me, a pair of pale, glowing eyes. Not human, not anything I could recognize, but they were there, staring right at me through the mirror, and in that moment, I felt a cold chill wash over me, a sensation so deep it froze my very bones. I glanced back at the road, my vision swimming, my mind struggling to comprehend what I had just seen. The world felt unreal now, like I was trapped in a nightmare. I pressed harder on the accelerator, but the car felt heavier, sluggish, like something was holding it back, pulling it down. My eyes flicked once more to the rearview mirror, and there it was again, the eyes. But this time, the shadow that hovered in the reflection had a face. I couldn't see it clearly, but I knew it was there. A twisted, hollow face that stared at me, eyes wide, unblinking, watching my every move. It wasn't just an illusion anymore. I could feel the presence, right behind me in the car, in the very space that should have been empty. I wanted to scream, but the words lodged in my throat, choked by the suffocating fear that gripped me. The road, the night, the figure. It was all blending together into something nightmarish, something that didn't belong in the real world. A flicker of motion in the rearview mirror caught my eye once more. This time, the figure wasn't in the reflection. It was outside the car, a flash of movement. It was running beside me, matching my speed, its outline just out of view. I pressed the pedal to the floor, the car's engine roaring in protest, but the thing kept pace. My mind was unraveling as I tried to make sense of it, tried to force my brain to focus on something, anything, other than the horrifying reality of what was happening. I stole a glance at the side mirror, and that's when I saw it, just in the corner of my eye, a shape darting across the road, too fast for me to make out clearly. But I could feel it. I could feel its presence. It was everywhere now, closing in from all sides, and I was trapped. The highway stretched on, a never-ending expanse of black asphalt, and I realized then that it didn't matter how far I drove. It didn't matter how fast I went. I would never escape. The thing, the entity, the presence, it had already claimed me, claimed my mind, my soul, my very existence. And there was nothing I could do but drive. Faster, harder, hoping to outrun the terror that had taken hold of me. But no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, I could feel it gaining on me, its cold breath brushing against my neck, its eyes boring into my very soul. I couldn't escape, and I knew deep down that I never would. It was a typical drive through the woods, one of those long, winding stretches of highway that seemed to go on forever, where the trees lean in on both sides, blocking out most of the moonlight. I had taken this route countless times before, always in the late hours, but that night something felt off, like the air itself had thickened. It wasn't the usual quiet of the road. It was more oppressive, like something unseen was pressing in around me. At first, I thought it was just my tired mind, but as the minutes dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My headlights illuminated the path ahead, but beyond that, it was as if the world fell away into an abyss. I couldn't see past the tree line, but it felt like something was lurking just beyond the reach of my vision. I looked in the rearview mirror, as I often do when I'm alone, not thinking much of it. But this time, when I checked, I saw nothing unusual. No cars behind me, no headlights creeping up on my tail, but the longer I looked, the more unsettling the reflection became. The night felt quieter than usual, the kind of silence that presses on you, makes you feel like you're the only living thing for miles. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror again, I caught a flicker, a movement, a shadow. At first, I brushed it off as nothing, just a trick of the light, but the more I stared, the more it seemed like something was off. There was no one behind me, not even a flicker of headlights, but someone was in the reflection. At least, I thought I saw something. A shift in the dark, like a presence moving just out of sight, always just out of the corner of my eye. It was hard to tell, too fleeting, but I swear I saw it again. I tried to shake it off, speeding up, hoping the sense of unease would dissipate. But with every glance in the mirror, the shadow seemed to grow more defined, closer, like it was following me. I was imagining things, I told myself. This was just the fatigue setting in, a product of the isolation. Yet I couldn't stop checking the mirror. My hands gripped the wheel tighter as the tension in my chest built. A sudden sharp gust of wind rattled the car, making the trees groan and sway, and in that instant, I saw it again, closer this time. A dark shape moving at the same speed as I was, just behind the car, but I couldn't make it out clearly. It was like the shadow of something that didn't belong. I slammed my foot on the gas, pushing the car faster, trying to outrun whatever was behind me. But when I glanced again, the shape had shifted. It was no longer directly behind me. Now it was to the side, barely visible, but always there, just beyond the headlights. My heart raced as I struggled to keep my focus on the road ahead, my mind reeling with questions I couldn't answer. What was it? Who was it? It didn't feel like just a shadow, though. It felt like something else, something watching me. Every time I looked in the mirror, it seemed to move a little closer, always just out of reach. I thought I heard something then, a soft tapping on the side of my car, like something brushing against it, a whisper of movement that sent a chill crawling up my spine. I couldn't stop looking in the mirror now. I felt trapped in it, like the road had no end and the dark presence behind me was the only thing keeping me company. It wasn't just following me anymore. It was stalking me. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, the trees, anything. But the feeling of being watched was undeniable, and the shadow that flickered in the corner of the mirror was no longer a trick of the light. I could feel it growing stronger, closer. My eyes darted back and forth between the rear view and the road ahead, but every time I looked back, it was like the figure was right there, always just a moment behind. The tapping sound grew louder, more insistent, like something was dragging along the side of the car, just below my window. I wanted to stop, to pull over, but a voice in my head, cold and rational, told me not to. Don't stop. Whatever it is, don't let it catch you. I tried to go faster, but the car felt heavier, sluggish. The engine roared, but it was like something was holding me back. The lights from my headlights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the trees. And then, just as I was about to glance back in the mirror again, I saw it, the figure, but it wasn't human, at least not in any way I could understand. Its shape was barely visible, like a shadow among shadows, but its presence filled the air with a thick, suffocating weight. It wasn't standing still anymore. It was moving, keeping pace with my car, its outline barely perceptible, as if it was more part of the darkness than the world around it. I couldn't make out any features, no face, no body, but I could feel its eyes on me. I was certain of it. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt dry, and my mouth refused to form words. I glanced at the side mirror again, and that's when I saw it. The figure wasn't just behind me anymore. It was beside me, just on the edge of the headlights' glow. And that's when I realized something worse. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even alive. It was something else, something unnatural. The tapping on my car grew louder, almost rhythmic, and then the sound stopped. There was nothing but silence, a suffocating silence, and I realized then that the car was no longer moving. My foot was still on the gas, but we weren't going anywhere. I was stuck. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to rev the engine, but it didn't respond. The figure beside me moved closer, its presence pressing in on me like an invisible weight. Couldn't look away, couldn't move. The darkness around me felt alive now, like it was swallowing me whole. My breath came in shallow gasps, my hands shaking on the wheel as I fought to stay calm. I was trapped in the middle of nowhere, with something that wasn't just following me. It was feeding on my fear, drawing closer, until I could feel its cold touch on my skin. I finally tore my eyes away from the figure beside me, but it didn't matter. It was already inside the car with me, just beyond the glass, and I could feel its cold fingers brushing against my neck, its breath on my cheek, whispering something I couldn't hear, but I knew it was a warning. Whatever it was never going to let me go. I've always been a creature of habit, and there was nothing out of the ordinary about my late-night drive that night. The kind of drive that's soothing, even comforting, as I navigate the long stretches of highway that seem to stretch on forever, where the world feels like it's miles away. But something about that night felt different from the moment I turned onto the highway. The usual hum of my car's engine felt almost too quiet, like it was being drowned out by something I couldn't quite hear, something lurking just out of reach. As I passed the usual landmarks, the old gas station on the corner, the lone diner that never seemed to close, an odd sense of unease crawled up my spine, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on me, but it didn't go away. The road, long and deserted as it always was, felt heavier, more oppressive, like something was pressing down on me. And then I saw it, or rather, I didn't see it, not at first. At the corner of my eye, just past the edge of the headlights, there was something moving, a shadow, but not just any shadow. It was too solid, too deliberate, and it was following me. I shook my head, blinking to clear the sleep from my eyes, but when I looked again, the shadow was still there. It was too far off for me to make out any shape, but the way it shifted, the way it seemed to follow my movements, it was unmistakable. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, a bug on my windshield, something I'd misinterpreted. But my gut told me otherwise. The hair on my arms stood straight as I pressed my foot harder on the accelerator, my eyes glued to the dark stretch of road ahead. I glanced in my rearview mirror. Nothing. For a split second, relief washed over me. I was just being paranoid, I thought. But then I saw it again, just ahead in the reflection, still following me, moving in and out of the shadows, always there but never fully visible. My heart began to race, and a chill of dread crept up my spine. I floored the gas pedal, pushing the car faster, the engine roaring as I sped down the highway. But no matter how fast I went, the shadow never got further away. It was always there, a persistent, creeping presence that seemed to be closing in on me, as if it were tethered to the very road itself. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just being followed. I was being hunted. The sound of my tires on the asphalt seemed muffled, as though the very road was swallowing the noise, making the silence feel all the more oppressive. My mind raced, trying to come up with any explanation for what was happening. But deep down, I knew this was no coincidence. I was being stalked, and no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't escape. The air in the car seemed to grow colder, heavier, and the strange sensation of being watched gnawed at me from every angle. I dared a quick glance at the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it, the figure. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was a shape, an outline that seemed to flicker in and out of existence like a bad TV signal, as if reality itself was struggling to hold it together. It had no discernible features, just a dark, swirling mass, like a cloud of smoke, but with edges that were sharper than they should have been. And then it moved. No, it surged toward me, closing the distance between us in a way that shouldn't have been possible. My breath caught in my throat, panic clawing at my chest as I slammed my foot down on the brake, the tires screeching as the car jerked to a halt. I looked around wildly, my hands shaking on the wheel. The highway was completely empty. Nothing but the road, the trees, the darkness. But I could still feel it, whatever it was, closing in, right behind me. I didn't dare look in the mirror again. I didn't have to. I could feel it, the oppressive weight of its presence. It was right there, just behind me, but I couldn't see it. Not fully, not yet. The engine sputtered, as if the very life of the car was. It was supposed to be a short, uneventful drive down the highway, a routine trip back home after a long day, but it turned into something else entirely. The highway was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in on you, making you aware of every sound and every breath, like the world is holding its breath with you. The only light came from the pale glow of my headlights cutting through the darkness, and the hum of my car's engine, steady and familiar. But as the miles stretched on, I began to feel it, the sensation of being watched. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the creeping loneliness of the empty road getting to me. But then I saw something move on the side of the road, too fast for me to make out. My pulse quickened as I glanced nervously in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing there. No cars, no lights, just the endless stretch of asphalt. I pushed it aside, telling myself it was just an animal, a shadow. But as I drove on, the feeling grew stronger, like something was there, something that wasn't supposed to be. I checked the mirror again, this time more slowly, and that's when I saw it. A figure. At first, it was nothing more than a blur, a shape darting from one shadow to another, too fast for me to get a clear look. But it was there, and it was following me. My heart started racing, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I sped up, hoping to shake whatever it was off, but every time I glanced in the mirror, it was closer. The shape was vague, like a smear of dark smoke, something not quite human, but unmistakably there. I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. My car's engine seemed to struggle, and the quiet of the highway grew heavier, the hum of my tires on the road muffled, as though the very world was pressing in on me. I glanced at the road ahead. Nothing had changed. No other cars. No signs of life. The loneliness of the highway felt oppressive now, like I was the only one left in the world, with this thing lurking just behind me. I glanced in the rear view again. The figure was still there, now clearer. It wasn't fully formed, not like a person, but more like a shifting shadow, a mass that seemed to move in unnatural ways, its edges flickering in and out of existence. It was close now, too close. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I tried to shake the fear out of my mind. It wasn't real, I told myself. Couldn't be. But every instinct in me screamed that I wasn't alone, that something was out there, something that wanted me. The highway stretched on endlessly, and no matter how fast I drove, it was never enough to escape. The figure kept pace, as if it was tethered to the road itself. I thought about stopping, pulling over, but something told me not to. Something told me that if I stopped, it would catch me, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know what would happen then. So I drove faster, my foot pressed firmly on the gas pedal, the engine roaring, but still, the figure didn't get any further away. The darkness around me seemed to close in, and the air grew thick, heavy with the scent of something I couldn't place. The silence was unbearable now, broken only by the sound of my speeding car and the distant whispers that seemed to come from all around me, barely audible but unmistakable. I tried to ignore them, but the words were there, words that made no sense, whispers that seemed to echo inside my head, feeding my fear. I glanced again in the rearview mirror, and this time, the figure was right behind me. It was no longer a vague shape, but something that I could almost make out. A twisting, writhing form, like a patch of smoke or fog, but alive, somehow with tendrils reaching out, moving toward me. I screamed, my foot slamming harder on the gas as I tried to outrun it, but it was no use. The figure was faster than I could ever be. It was gaining on me, its form now unmistakable, like the shadow of something far older, far more sinister than anything I could understand. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold, empty eyes that pierced through the rearview mirror, locking onto me with a terrifying intensity. I tried to steer the car, weaving between the lanes, hoping to shake it, but the figure was always there, just behind me, as though it had no intention of ever letting me go. The road stretched on, endless and empty, the darkness swallowing everything. I could hear it now, the low hum of its presence, vibrating through the car, seeping into my bones. I was trapped, and I knew it. The whispers were louder now, more insistent, almost like a chant. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. The terror in my chest told me everything I needed to know. This thing wasn't just following me, it was hunting me. I had to get away. I had to find a way to escape. But the more I drove, the more I realized there was no escape. No matter how far I went, the figure was always there, always just behind me, like a predator stalking its prey. My mind was racing, trying to think of something, anything that could stop it, but I couldn't think straight. I glanced down at the dashboard. The gas gauge was nearly empty. The engine sputtered, and for a moment, I thought I might lose power, but the car kept going. I didn't know how. I didn't care. All I cared about was getting away. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the road ahead started to change. The asphalt twisted, like the highway itself was warping, bending in unnatural ways. The lines in the road blurred, the lights flickered, and the familiar surroundings of the highway became distorted, like I was driving through a nightmare. The figure was still there, just behind me, but now it seemed to be multiplying, more and more of them stretching out behind me, stretching out into the abyss. I knew I had to stop, but I couldn't. I was too scared to stop, too scared to see what would happen if I did. And then, a voice, soft and mocking, whispered in my ear, "You'll never escape." And in that moment, I knew it was true. The road would never end. The figure would never stop following me. I was trapped, forever bound to this highway, this endless, lonely stretch of asphalt that had become my prison. And there was no escape. I had been driving for what felt like hours, the headlights of my car slicing through the pitch-black night, the only sound the hum of the tires against the lonely highway. It was a road I'd traveled before, a route I knew well, straight, empty, and stretching endlessly into the night, with nothing but the occasional flicker of a distant street lamp to break the monotony. I was on my way home after a long day at work, tired, frustrated, and eager to get back to the comfort of my bed. But for some reason tonight, the road felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a stillness that clung to the surroundings like fog, and an unnerving sensation that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't until I reached the old stretch of highway, the part where the trees seemed to crowd in on the road, that I felt the first twinge of unease. I had seen that stretch 1,000 times, but tonight, the shadows cast by the trees seemed deeper, more oppressive, as if they were reaching for me. I told myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks, but the uneasy feeling only grew as I drove on. It wasn't long before I noticed something odd in my rearview mirror, just a flicker of light. At first, I thought it was another car behind me, but when I glanced again, the lights were gone. I felt a shiver run down my spine, chalking it up to fatigue. I pressed on, trying to focus on the road, but the sensation of being watched lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was following me. I told myself it was just the isolation of the highway messing with my mind, but when the lights appeared again, this time much closer, I knew it was something else. I pressed the gas pedal harder, my car speeding up as I tried to put some distance between myself and whatever was behind me. The headlights behind me grew brighter, blinding me, and I could hear the faint hum of an engine. But when I glanced in my mirror again, there was nothing there, just the empty road, stretching on in the darkness. My heart raced, and my palms began to sweat as I realized something was seriously wrong. I drove faster, my eyes darting nervously between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. The headlights returned, closer than before, but this time there was no car in sight. No vehicle, no shape, just a shadow of light that seemed to move in impossible ways. My pulse quickened, and I felt my stomach drop as I realized it wasn't just a car. It was something else, something unnatural, something that had no business being on this road. The shadow moved erratically, darting back and forth, weaving in and out of the lane as if it was being controlled by an unseen hand. I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding faster, but no matter how fast I went, the shadow kept pace, staying right behind me. My breath came in shallow gasps, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel with white-knuckled intensity. It was as if the very road itself had turned against me, twisting and stretching endlessly, making it impossible to escape. I tried to turn off the highway onto a side road, desperate for some way out, but no matter where I went, the shadow followed, always just behind me, like a ghostly specter that refused to let go. The lights would appear in the rearview mirror, blink out and reappear, growing closer and closer until they felt like they were right on top of me. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped, surrounded by the darkness of the highway with nowhere to turn, nowhere to hide. I glanced down at my fuel gauge, and to my horror, it was empty. My car was running on fumes. The engine sputtered, and I could feel the car losing power. I was running out of time, and whatever was behind me was closing in. In a blind panic, I slammed the brakes, sending the car skidding to a halt. For a moment, everything was still silent. I sat there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, trying to make sense of what was happening. But just as I thought I might be safe, the engine cut out completely, leaving me in the dead silence of the night, alone in the middle of nowhere. I fumbled for my phone, but it was dead, the screen black and lifeless. I couldn't even call for help. My eyes darted back to the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. Something dark and impossible, shifting in the distance. It wasn't a person, not a thing made of flesh and blood. It was something else, something that defied logic and reason. A formless, shadowy mass that seemed to grow and shrink with each blink. It was as though it was alive, something ancient and malevolent, and it was coming for me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could hear the blood rushing in my ears as the shadow drew closer. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me, an overwhelming sensation that I was not alone, that something was reaching for me, drawing closer with every passing second. Couldn't escape, couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my body paralyzed with fear, as the shadow finally engulfed my car. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere was being sucked into the void of whatever this thing was. I could hear faint whispers, like voices coming from a great distance, but they seemed to be right next to me, echoing inside my head. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The darkness pressed in on all sides, and I felt as though I was being pulled into something deep, something that would swallow me whole. I don't know how long it lasted, but eventually, the whispering stopped, the weight lifted, and the oppressive darkness seemed to recede, leaving behind only the sound of my labored breathing. When I dared to look again, I saw nothing in the rearview mirror, nothing at all. But I knew it was still there, waiting for me to move, to turn back, to give in. I didn't stay, couldn't. I pushed open the door, stumbling out into the night, the sound of the highway stretching endlessly behind me. I walked for what seemed like hours, but no matter how far I went, the road never ended. It just kept going, stretching on with no sign of escape. And though I couldn't see it anymore, I could still feel the presence, that shadow, that thing, following me, just behind me, just out of reach, waiting. It was a road that never ends, a journey with no destination. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I would never be free. It was well past midnight when I found myself driving down that desolate stretch of highway, the one I always try to avoid but seem to end up on every few months. I don't know why I can't stay away from it, even though I know something's off about that road, like it's cursed or haunted. The trees on either side grow so thick that they block out most of the stars, and the asphalt beneath my tires is cracked and uneven, giving the whole place an old, neglected feeling. I had just finished a long, exhausting drive through the mountains and was hoping to get to the next town as quickly as possible. But the further I drove, the more I felt like the road itself was fighting me, dragging me deeper into its grip. It started with the sounds. At first, it was nothing more than the hum of my engine and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. But slowly, I began to hear something else. A soft, almost imperceptible tapping sound, like someone was lightly knocking on the window. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe a branch brushing against the car, but the sound persisted, growing louder with each passing minute. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, expecting to see a car, but there was nothing. No headlights, no shadows, just empty road behind me. Still, the tapping continued, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there. I tried to ignore it, but every time I looked in the mirror, the tapping would stop. I would focus on the road, then hear it again, soft at first, then louder, almost like a rhythmic pattern. I could feel my heart start to race as I glanced into the side mirror, but there was no one there, not a soul in sight. Then came the whispers, soft at first, like a breeze moving through the trees, but soon they became clearer. Faint murmurs, just barely audible, coming from all around me. It sounded like a conversation in a language I couldn't understand, but the words were strangely familiar, like they were part of a memory I had forgotten. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, the fear creeping up my spine as the whispers turned to a low, guttural sound, like someone was trying to speak but couldn't form the words. And then, just when I thought I might lose my mind, I heard a voice. It wasn't coming from the speakers. It was coming from the back seat. A voice so low, so close, that it sent chills straight to my bones. It didn't say anything I could make out, just a low, rasping sound, but I could feel its presence, its breath hot on my neck. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing there. The back seat was empty, just the shadows of the night creeping in through the windows. Still, the voice continued, like it was in my mind, whispering, taunting, driving me closer to the edge of madness. I slammed my foot on the gas, hoping to outrun whatever it was that was following me. But no matter how fast I went, the voice stayed with me, growing louder. The road stretched endlessly before me, no end in sight, and the whispers turned into full-blown laughter. Not a friendly kind of laughter, but a deep, mocking laugh like someone was watching me suffer. I looked in the rearview mirror again, this time with a sense of urgency, but the laughter stopped. There was nothing behind me, just darkness, but I knew it was still there. I could feel it. The road had changed. The trees were taller now, their branches reaching out like twisted hands, blocking out what little light the moon had to offer. The air had thickened, and the car felt heavier, as if something invisible was pressing down on it. The laughter had stopped, but the whispers had returned, louder now, more insistent. And then, in the distance, I saw a light. It wasn't the bright headlights of a car, but a small, flickering light, like a lantern. It was strange, out of place. I wasn't sure if it was a sign of hope or another trick of the road, but I couldn't resist. I had to see it. I veered off the road, following the light, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, the light grew dimmer, like it was fading away, but I kept going, desperate to get closer. And then I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. It wasn't a person, not entirely. It looked like a woman, but her features were distorted, stretched out, as if her body couldn't fit into the space it was occupying. She was standing completely still, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, and her eyes were wide open, unblinking, staring directly at me. I wanted to stop, to turn around, but I couldn't. My foot was frozen on the gas, and I was getting closer and closer. I could see her now, her pale skin gleaming in the dim light, and her mouth was open wide, too wide, like a snake ready to swallow me whole. The closer I got, the louder the whispers became, until they were deafening, drowning out everything else. The last thing I remember before I hit the brakes was her smile, her impossibly wide, jagged smile. And then, everything went dark. I woke up in the car, disoriented, but the road was gone. The trees had vanished, the darkness had swallowed everything, and I was sitting in the middle of a vast, empty space. The whispers were gone, but the silence was worse. I tried to start the car, but it wouldn't move. I was stuck in the middle of nowhere, with no sign of life, no sign of escape. I had driven down that highway many times before, but I realized now I wasn't supposed to make it to the end. The road wasn't meant for me. It never was. The whispers were still with me, just beneath the surface of my mind, waiting to come back, to pull me deeper into the abyss. And that's when I understood the truth. The highway never ends. It just keeps going, forever.